Good evening, everyone. Hello. Thanks for being here. My name is Matthew Hall. I'm the Associate Director of the Cornell Catholic Community. Thank you, Kelly and Victoria, for arranging the dinner. This has been delicious. Maybe we should, as we're finishing up, and maybe you want to get some water or cookies or something to finish, maybe we could just give thanks to the Lord for all he has given us. We give you thanks, Almighty God, for all your benefits, who live and reign forever and ever. Amen. And may the souls of the faithful departed through the mercy of God rest in peace. Amen. I'm going to turn it over to my lovely wife, Elizabeth, who's going to introduce tonight's esteemed speaker.
Hi, everyone. Great to see you, and I hope you all had a wonderful fall break. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Elizabeth Lyon Hall, and I'm the director of Lumen Institute for Catholic Thought and Culture here at Cornell United Religious Work. Thank you so much for coming, and I'd like to extend a special welcome to our friends coming in from Binghamton Newman House, from St. Bernard's School, and also from Tyburn Academy. You are most welcome. Colus, which is Latin for hill, aims to develop Catholic thought, culture, and community here at Cornell University and beyond, enriching students, faculty, staff, and community members of all religious backgrounds. We provide a forum for the study of the Catholic intellectual and cultural traditions through public lectures, seminars, sacred music, community outreach, and more. I'm excited to introduce theologian Dr. Matthew Ramage as our speaker tonight. Professor Ramage gave a great seminar last night on what Catholicism brings to the environmental conversation, and also today he led a fantastic Bible study on dark passages of the Bible. So I know you're in for a treat for this talk. When I think about some of the areas I want to make sure that every Catholic grad from Cornell is able to speak to when you go off into the wider world, the Catholic position on evolution is high on the list. It serves as an exemplar on how Catholicism makes sense on the relationship of faith, reason, and science, and models how the Church is part of the living tradition of thought. It shows how theologians do respond to modern scientific developments, and how it's possible to be a good Catholic and a good scientist. So I'm very grateful that Professor Ramage is here to introduce us to these topics. Dr. Ramage is professor of theology at Benedictine College, where he is co-director of its Center for Integral Ecology. His research and writing concentrates especially on the theology of Joseph Ratzinger, that is Pope Benedict XVI, the wedding of ancient and modern methods of biblical interpretation, the dialogue between faith and science, and stewardship of creation. He is the author of many, many books. Some that I particularly recommend are Dark Passages of the Bible, and From the Dust of the Earth, Benedict XVI, the Bible, and the Theory of Evolution. He's also a human being when he's not doing research. He has 8 children now. The newest, baby James, was born a few weeks ago. He enjoys tending his orchard, leading educational trips abroad, and aspiring to be a barbecue pitmaster. Before we begin, I'd like to extend my special thanks to Cornell Catholic Community for hosting this lovely event, to the Society of Catholic Scientists for helping to promote this event, and Steve Jesch, if you would just raise your hand over there. Steve Jesch is the president of our local chapter of the Society of Catholic Scientists. So if you want to talk to him, find him after the lecture. And also a big thanks to Lumen Christi Institute, who is supporting this event with funding from the John Templeton Foundation. So without further ado, please help me welcome Professor Matthew Ramage.
Hi. Thanks so much, Lizzie. How is it in the back? Can you hear me in the back of those tables? Great. It is outstanding to be here. I'm excited to be with you guys. So yes, I hail from Kansas. It's not fall yet in Kansas, really. So it's beautiful to be here. I saw Buttermilk Falls today. Good to see the local ecosystem. And so I am thrilled to talk on this topic in particular because, as Lizzie said, it's one of the topics that comes up the most. It's actually cited up there amongst one of the top reasons people leave their faith, the perceived incompatibility of faith and science, evolution in particular. People knock on my door, both literally and metaphorically, all the time about this. I get random emails on the internet, most of which are answered, some of which are not. I get students coming to my class, I heard this in biology, Dr. Ramage, or I heard this in theology. How do you reconcile these two? Well, it turns out We have one doctor of the church now and one probable future doctor, Ratzinger, who talked about this a lot. So I want to share insights from them and also go a little bit beyond the book, so to speak, in doing this. And I have a guiding quote I want to start with. So this is from Pope John Paul II, who also spoke a lot on faith and reason, and it outlines my scope. So theology serves all their disciplines in their search for meaning by bringing a perspective and orientation not contained within their own methodologies. In turn, interaction with these other disciplines and their discoveries enriches theology. In other words, the job of theology, as we see it as the church, is to help illuminate the discoveries you make if you're out in the sciences, not to do the science. Meanwhile, we actually think that theology can be enriched. One that I don't have up here is John Paul II, in writing a letter to the head of the Vatican Observatory. By the way, Vatican Observatory, we love science. He asked him, amongst other scientists, especially biologists, might an evolutionary perspective illuminate the human person and our vocation? So those are the sorts of things we're asking. As you see here, though, both must preserve their autonomy. They have a mutual reciprocal relationship. One is not the other. So how do you go about that? Well, we're going to use evolution. And it's usually a good idea to start with Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins, if you're familiar with him, he likes to criticize the Catholic faith or the Christian faith more generally. But I think he poses the question really well. And that is, basically before Darwin, it was hard to be a satisfied atheist. Now evolution made it easy to be a satisfied atheist. Now then you hear that, and a lot of Christians are tempted to swing the other way. Well, now evolution's maybe only for atheists. Thankfully, the Catholic Church says otherwise. The Catholic Church is usually in the both and category. It's faith and science, faith and reason, faith and love. And here's how I want people to not answer evolution. So why the little jellyfish image? Lizzie mentioned I'm a Pope Benedict scholar, the Pope who talked about this the most of any Pope. And he says, sometimes we have the feeling that when you enter the modern world and the church is developing doctrine, you feel like the faith is a jellyfish. Like, oh my goodness, is there going to be nothing to grab onto anymore? You know, all of a sudden, Mass is not in Latin, and then, you know, the Bible's in English, and now we don't believe in the Eucharist anymore. You know, it's very tempting to just hunker down. So how do we go about it in a way that's not fearful? We don't want to do this. This is an actual road sign I saw during grad school, and I didn't take a picture. I went on the internet and found this picture. But I was very tempted to write a letter to that pastor of that church. You know, look it up in the literal yellow pages at the time. And then I realized I had a PhD paper due, so I didn't do that. But the Catholic Church keeps us from falling into two opposing errors. And I've done some yellow highlighting on here. I like to focus on certain words. So scientism is a term that John Paul II, I believe, coined to refer to science when it goes outside of its lane and it claims to have the exclusive rights to knowledge, sometimes also called empiricism. The opposite error is fideism, Latin for faithism. That's when you desire to believe against reason, as Pope Benedict defines it here. Faith alone, and it's not just non-Catholics, sometimes Catholics fall into this. Whereas for John Paul II, in his encyclical letter on faith and reason, he describes the two as the two wings on which the human spirit soars to the contemplation of truth. You really need them both. So faith needs to have a basis in reality. Grace builds on nature, like Thomas Aquinas says. So students, here's a good example. I'm sure you all sleep enough every night, right? And if you don't sleep enough, you're tired, you get angry. If you're hungry and you don't have a lot of meatballs like tonight, you get hangry, okay? Your faith needs to have a rational basis to it. You should not believe the Trinity means 3 equals 1. It's nonsense. So John Paul II has one more quote from him that I want to share with you here. Let's see if I can get it to advance. And one of my students came up with a metaphor. She says it's like a membrane. And okay, you can try this on for size biologists, but her point was the membrane allows some things to pass through and some things not to. I thought that was really a nice metaphor because he's saying that each has a mutual purification factor. Science can actually purify religion. Religion can purify science. And interestingly, let's just to pick on my own discipline here for a minute. I ask my students sometimes, well, how can science purify religion? And they'll sometimes criticize non-Catholics. But I tell them, well, wait a minute. It applies to all of us. And Pope Benedict had a word I didn't put up here. He said, sometimes we fall into ecclesiasticism, a word that refers to the idea that only the Catholic Church has any truth at all. The Church believes that all truth is actually of the Holy Spirit. So you'll be happy to know I cut out about 10 slides last night. And a few of those are, I go through different areas like the Society of Catholic Scientists does on their website, where there have been Catholic scientists like Father Georges Lemaitre, who had the theory of the primeval atom, which becomes the Big Bang theory. We have all these different areas. But I'm not going to lie. You're going to see later, I'll give some citations. I have some good images and good evidence for evolution I get from Richard Dawkins, atheist, doesn't even like Christians. So Aquinas, everybody who's Catholic knows he's a good guy Catholic, right? But his bishop didn't see it that way. He was taking this pagan fella and using him for Catholicism. You know who it was, guys? Aristotle. And anyway, he had his books banned temporarily for that. But that's what Aquinas said. All truth, no matter its source, is of the Holy Spirit. I have to give you a church fathers line because I love the patristic era. The church fathers, they're interpreting the Israelites on the way out of Egypt. They steal all the Egyptian stuff, which is kind of a Jacques Valjean or Robin Hood moment. You can debate the morality of it, but the fathers will say, we need to despoil, plunder the Egyptians. That is to say, take the treasures of wisdom from the world wherever you might find them. And so with that said, what I want to do now is I'd like to just give you the church's actual position on evolution. And I'll preface this with the church's position is that you are not required to accept evolutionary theory, and you definitely are not required to reject it. But you'll see what the popes actually think on this subject here. So first of all, the theory of evolution as a scientific hypothesis. This is the Catholic Encyclopedia, which is not magisterial, but look at the date on that. You guys see that? 1909. So in 1909, the church thinks this is in perfect agreement with the Catholic faith. And then I can't read my own screen here because of my detached retina. But Pius XII in 1950, the second quote, interestingly, that's the only papal encyclical, usually the highest level of papal document, that talks about it. And he has one little caveat here that's important. He says, the body can evolve, but not the soul. Now, theologians like me are involved in what does that mean? But even in 1950, when the evidence for evolutionary theory was much more sparse than it is now, that was okay. John Paul II famously calls it more than a hypothesis back in the 80s and 90s. And then what is the ITC, you might ask? The Vatican has an internal theological commission that I wish I was on. It's awesome. And they say there's converging evidence from multiple disciplines, and it makes the theory virtually certain. But like I said, the Pope who spoke about it the most was Pope Benedict. Pope Benedict was the right-hand man of John Paul II from 1978 to 2004, and he was Pope until 2013. And like I said, I wrote a book on that one. And he speaks of many proofs for it. And one of my favorite quotes in a book whose title I'll have on my concluding slide today is he says, we shouldn't be saying creation or evolution. We should be saying creation and evolution. And he continues to say after that, because they answer different questions. But I was translating a dialogue in Italian between Benedict and an atheist Italian mathematician for my Catholic World Report column that I do once a month. And this guy, Odifreddi, he was claiming that evolution contradicted the faith. And look what Benedict says. He says, no serious theologian will contest that the tree of life is such that we all have a common ancestry. So it's not that Odie Freddy has a good argument. In other words, the atheist is making a caricature of Christians. And then a couple more here. These are not from theologians, but I want to see a show of hands just out of my own curiosity, guys. Who's ever read Chesterton? Anybody? But who's in the Chesterton, the house, I'm going to call it Christian frat. Yeah, okay. You see what Chesterton says here? He says, it's stingless for the most orthodox. It's funny, 100 years later, maybe the most orthodox don't agree with that statement. But nevertheless, second, Fulton Sheen. Everybody loves Fulton Sheen. It's a legitimate theory. John Henry Newman, though, the one I really want to talk about. I have two quotes to share. This first one is the fun one. So he had a colleague who was saying that it sure looks like things evolved. Like, yeah, I'll grant you, it sure looks like the carbon dating works. It looks like these bones are millions of years old. But God put the fossils in the rocks. Somebody could probably guess why. To test your faith. So Newman's reply is, I'll go whole hog with Darwin, or just dispense with time and history and say not only that God created fully formed species, but he put the rocks in the fossils. So Newman's basically saying, well, at least I admire your consistency, my friend. In other words, either things evolved or God made it look like it to test your faith. And then his other one, I'm going to quote this probably 3 times tonight. So I'm not going to try to pronounce this in a British accent. But no one uses the word prescience in American English, I don't think. Okay? I see nothing in the theory of evolution inconsistent with an almighty creator. Mr. Darwin's theory need not be atheistical. It may be simply suggesting a larger idea of divine prescience and skill, divine foreknowledge, pre-science. So that's the theme I want to run with, is that as we look at how God works in evolution, it's actually a wiser order than if he had created things directly. And so now, in this next section, I'm going to do a little bit of review, and I tell our scientists, you can always correct me on anything in what follows. I'm taking the data scientists give me, and I want to put some meat on the bones of evolution. Here's why. I think you shouldn't talk about this in the abstract. And some of you won't know this either. I think you're going to find this really cool if you don't know it already. I have a habit that I do personally and I do as a family. We go out into nature a lot. We are national park junkies. And I go to great lengths to this. Like last week, I mentioned last night, I was in Yosemite because I was giving a lecture in San Francisco. And as one does, one rents a car and drives 4 hours in the middle of nowhere, California. And then you go to Yosemite. My colleagues thought I was crazy, but that's what I did. So anyway, the point would be I want to meditate on nature a little bit. And I'm going to use Newman to do this. So Newman has a very robust epistemology, theory of knowledge. He wrote a book called An Essay on the Grammar of Assent. What does it mean to assent, to accept different kinds of truths? So I have a couple of areas, like from the Vatican, I have this definition of evolution from common ancestor, give or take 3.5 billion years ago. And then I wanted to discuss the word theory. If you're in the sciences, you may even have a slightly different definition of theory than someone else in another science or someone else in your building. But I think what we need to do first of all is Newman would reject the idea that evolution is a theory in the way most people use it in America today. Because think about this, it's just a theory. What's the synonym for that? It's just a, conjecture, opinion, right? But as you scientists know, a theory is well established. I love Father Nicanor Astriaco, the Dominican biologist. He has street cred because he has a PhD in bio and theology, and he has a line where he says, look, gravity's a theory, evolution's a theory, plate tectonics is a theory. That's the theory we mean here. Okay, but how does Newman come in? Okay, I have 5 points from Newman. I want to flesh out his epistemology. And mind you, something really fascinating about Newman, he was a contemporary of Darwin. Remember that line about, I'll just go full of Darwin or else make me fossils straight in the rocks? And he thinks it's even wiser. I don't even know if I would have been on board with evolution in the late 1800s. But Newman was wise, and he saw how things were. So the first quote is, in his idea of the university, Newman talks about how science and faith each have their own great circles of knowledge, different methods. And the second one, where you see the yellow, is going to be what I consider the most important point. I see a parallel here between inductive reasoning and what Newman's talking about. He says, much of the time we arrive at certainty not through proof, not through deduction in the sense of geometry, but we arrive at it through what he calls an accumulation of evidence or accumulated probabilities, converging lines of evidence. And so examples of this, which I would have made subpoints if not for room, he gives the example of his dad. So he says, I don't have the ability to prove my dad wasn't a murderer. My dad might be a murderer, but I would be heartless to think he was. I like to give the example of my own dad. My own dad, I don't think he did the following, but things happen in war. My dad was in Vietnam, okay? But my mom, if you knew Sue Ramage, she never heard a fly, okay? It could turn out that Sue Ramage, of 78 years of age right now, is a spy, right? She's part of the KGB, you know? Is it possible my mom's doing that? It has to be possible. But what's actually more credible? You know, it's actually more rational to just accept she's a normal woman who doesn't know anything about spying. That's an important point from Newman. And then a second one, he says it's like a cable. You know, I like to fish. So if you have braided line, you're trying to catch sharks, you want to have that because it's actually, and the physicists could get in here, or engineers, it's more than the sum of its parts. So what happens is any individual thread would not be sufficient to establish certainty. In other words, there are lots of things in life where, oh, you know, well, like with the fossil record, it could be that evolution's false because, you know, we don't yet know how hemoglobin evolved. Things like that. Well, individually, there's different areas that you can't prove 100%, but you add them up, and Newman says the force of the argument is greatly superior to any one on their own. So he gives the example of Great Britain and Ireland. He says, as a Brit, I can't prove to you Great Britain's an island because he can't see all angles on it at the same time. He doesn't have GPS. But just even think about this. If Newman were alive today, he had GPS, you could always still say, yes, the GPS shows me it's an island, but the GPS is AI. It's fake news, right? So those sorts of things. So there's a certain point in which trust comes in just to have any knowledge whatsoever in life. Now with that, here's where I get into the actual evolution and some picture time. My angle on this is from Pope Francis. He thinks we should think of creation not as a problem to be solved, but as a joyful mystery to be contemplated. I was talking about this line last night, but it's so important I did it again. So I like to go through some of the strands of evidence over the years. I pick up from my scientist colleagues, I pick up from national park signage, from continuing to read. I like to tell my students, back when I was a biology major, they hadn't even finished the Human Genome Project yet. And I dropped out of MCB in the middle of my senior credit year to go to seminary in Rome and never finish the degree. But I love to read nature. I consider myself an armchair naturalist, not in the atheist sense, but in the biology sense. I love fossil hunting, getting to know our local animals, rivers, etc. And St. Augustine says this, like I was talking about last night, creation is God's first book. You have the Bible as the book of God. I'm a specialist in that. But Every creature proclaims. Why look for a louder voice, he says. Heaven and earth cries out to you, God made me. So much so that our traditional proofs for God's existence come from looking at nature. There's a little peek at part of my show and tell here. You guys see my megalodon tooth up there in the middle? I've got a mosasaur vertebra. I've got some dino poop, some corpulite over there on the left. Dino poop next to the coffee mugs, you know. And just for the record, that's a great white tooth on the little napkin thingy below the megalodon tooth. That one in the back, whether you can make it out or not, there's a bivalve there from my town. We're from the Pennsylvanian period, so give or take 350 million years ago. And we're on the Missouri River in Kansas. It's actually not flat. And you can find things that look like they were on a beach today. You have to go a couple hours west to the Flint Hills to find the mosasaurs. But all this evidence is out there, and Dawkins actually says, looking at evolution is like looking at a jury trial. You have all these different angles, and there may be one piece of evidence where you have cameras, you know, you have one on the building's exterior, then you have one on the next block. You're not going to see the suspect the whole time, but you're going to piece together a really good picture where it's really incredible not to think he's the culprit. So I put some of these together. These are pictures from my travels. This is from Palo Duro Canyon. Anybody been there by chance? It's in Texas. It's drivable from my house. Second biggest canyon in America. I just really get a lot of joy out of life. And you may think I'm dumb, but I love being like, oh, the gray, that's Triassic rock, right? Oh, and the Permian, and oh, yeah, like the rusted ocean, and that's why it's red, and those sorts of things. Okay, this is what we do. Little family show and tell. There's the painted desert out there in Arizona. There's our daughter hanging around with some petrified wood. And I choose that one from the Petrified Forest National Park because, as you see in the visitor center, that's what it used to look like. So some people will say, well, that's not something I can repeat. I can't do the experiment. That's not the way this science works, right? We're looking at a jury trial type of scenario here. The evidence is all over the place. I love whales. I more or less consist in reading books and watching documentaries. But I was playing around, I think it was Caltech. No, it was Cal's website here. They have a nice evolution website. And I got into this one because I was watching one of those documentaries that tried to put flesh, use CGI to make it appear what Pakicetus, one of the ancestors up there toward the top, looked like. And if my memory serves me right, the closest genetic relative to the whale is the hippo. But the fascination of how we can trace these things, but you're never going to have every single link. If you have a link, you just actually create two more gaps. Good old paradox from Greek philosophy right there. And then you can go into human. No, this is not the way it looked. I said here below, it's much more complicated, but I still like the image, so I'm sticking with it. But I love the Smithsonian's exhibit on this in DC. And they have a great website I got this from. You know, like now we can look, and the scientists involved with this can speak more. I can be emended on anything later. But you know, you see Australopithecus several million years ago, you start to see the hominins grow more upright, the larger brain case, and we can trace more or less man's ancestry. The images I have here, they're partly from the Smithsonian, and the ones that are obviously not real, they're artistic fill-ins, are from a great theologian, Chris Baglow's book, where he has all the citations from the primary sources. But everybody knows about Lucy. You have Homo erectus, I think I put on here, where we're upright. You have the Laetoli footprints are famous because now they're walking upright. They're not walking on all fours. And then there's a depiction trying to give us a sense of what Homo heidelbergensis might have looked like. I wanted to mention that one because do you see the word Adam ? Theologically, this gets very interesting. When was Adam? Well, if you want to read Genesis literally, it's 6,000 years ago. But not many people are willing to go that far. I met a few. But if you're not going to read Genesis as video camera history, our job as theologians, and I'm on panels about this on a fairly routine basis, you got to figure out what are the scientists telling us, And then we do our best to try to see how that maps on with faith. So there's a really great theologian, if you're interested in this topic, you should know about Kenneth Kemp, K-E-M-P. He has a massive tome, if it's not out yet, it's soon, on the history of Catholicism's engagement with evolution. And he and I and a great Dominican in Rome, Father Mariusz Tabacek, were on an Aquinas panel last summer. And Kemp, his view is that Adam was Homo heidelbergensis. He thinks Adam was around 500 to 750,000 years ago. I'm not going to weigh in on that at the moment, but it seems to me as a theologian looking at it, he's got to be somewhere between 200,000 or 2 million. That'd be a fun question to discuss. Because for us following people like Aquinas and Aristotle, you know the soul by its actions. And so if you're making jewelry, if you're performing high quality art, then you're probably human. If you looked at my art, you'd probably think I wasn't human. You know, I know one of the things, I had a teacher in high school, God love him, he was a Christian anti-evolutionist biologist. And he used to talk about how there are no transitional fossils and structures. I mean, now we've got them all over the place. The scientists can talk about that. But you know, whether it's the eye going from pigmentation that focuses to the greater curvature that you see in more developed eyes, we could do that. It's been said before that wings can't have evolved. It's been said that birds aren't dinosaurs, but look at the cassowary. I mean, that thing wants to kill you. I mean, my chickens even want to kill me. They're just not big enough. I'm sure the cat would kill me if it was big enough. But you can trace the development of a structure that has a function for balance or gliding and eventually grows bigger. And what I as a theologian start to think when I look at this is, wow, God has a plan in eternity. And he wants to work it out gradually. He didn't have to do it that way. That's what we theologians say. But he chose to do it that way. And then you have the weird ones, like vestigial structures. Why do males have nipples? I don't have a, appendix anymore. But you know, why can we get along without that? Why do we still have tailbones? It is evidence for earlier stages in our lives. Venema, this guy I'm citing here, because obviously I didn't do the research myself. Venema is an evangelical Christian, and he and a theologian named Scott McKnight wrote a neat book called Adam and the Genome back in 2017, worth reading for sure. And among the many things he points out, he points out vitellogen in DNA. He says it's pretty curious that we still have the remnants, sure, not functioning, of yolk-producing DNA. It's really weird design. This is what an atheist would tell you. That's really bad design of your God. Why would he do that? But the Catholic who engages this subject doesn't have to say that. He can say, oh, that's really weird, but God's weird. He did it gradually, you know. Why do we still have traits in our lives we don't need anymore? Like wisdom teeth even, but that's just the way life is. And then you get things like whales. This is one of our colleagues at my institution. I didn't know this till about 5 years ago. Of course, I knew that whales were mammals, unlike one of my friends. I heard him say whales were fish. You know, that they have homologous structures. They're not fish, they have hands because they used to live on land. They feed their live young. Another one he told me about was chickens every so often with the atavism of teeth. My understanding is that they die, they don't make it, but dinosaurs used to have teeth. The flying dinosaurs survived, at least some of them did. And then I have one of my mentors, Monsignor Swetland, was a Rhodes Scholar who was our chaplain in college. And he told me last year he was on a medical ethics case of an atavism situation where, this is not the one, by the way, this is from a developing country, I forget which one. But the American Ethics Committee had to figure out what to do because the human baby had a tail. And this happens due to reactivation of all the things. So then you could get into things like genetics, you could get into plate tectonics, you know, thinking about how, even looking at the continents, how they look like they fit together because they used to fit together. Why do you have certain species only in certain places? Because they evolved after the split. Here's our kids working on a Pangea puzzle. We should buy this thing. except it's really easy because there's just like a few chunks and they all go together. But at the Petrified Forest National Park, they had this Pangea, that is literally in Greek, all earth, supercontinent. And I bring this one up, guys, because where I live in Kansas, look at the red circle. We're in that body of water there that was called the Western Interior Sea. So I just get a lot of joy out of going into central Kansas where they unearth these massive fossils. But as far as national parks go, I'm proud of my photo for starters. Grand Prismatic Spring. We took a trip to Yellowstone 5 years ago, and I love reading the placards, right? And so you see that it's going to blow at some point. But you see those red triangles. Plate tectonics, I don't know when plate tectonics began as a science. I'm pretty sure it was in the last 2 centuries. But the ancients didn't know this. And yet it's even more evident. So why do you have certain species only evolve on certain continents? So again, being who I am, we have to drive a couple or a few hours out of the way and go to another nearby national park system place. Has anybody been to this? It's Craters of the Moon. It's the size of Rhode Island, I believe they say. And that's what it looks like. And apparently that's what Yellowstone's going to look like someday. Okay, and then you could get into tracing like they do in our labs. They do fruit flies, the gradual evolution of the DNA there, or think of COVID with the virus. Now, that concludes my little meditative part. And now I want to get back really to theology. But there's some more charts I have from this biologist, Dennis Venema. This one, as a lover of languages, really appeals to me. So comparative genetics, those guys argue, the theologian and the biologist writing together, it's like the evolution of language. Think about, like I can read, I translate French, I translate various Romance languages, I can speak Italian pretty well. Although it's weird because I spent a couple months in Sicily and I couldn't understand much at all because of dialect, because it interacted with Arabic, different languages I don't know. Well, there's no point at which English exists. It's gradual. They all ultimately, Romance languages, come from Latin. But there was never a pure Latin either. That's a misnomer. Latin itself is ancient, and eventually you go back to Proto-Indo-European languages, that Sanskrit, Hebrew, Greek, Latin, just to name the ones I actually know. I don't know Sanskrit, sorry. But Sanskrit also is one of them. They all share that root, but guess what? We have to reconstruct what it looked like. But we don't have firsthand evidence. It's still certain, though. This is what Newman would say. You can trace back with certainty. So these I thought were really cool. They go through and they're going to get into olfactory genes. But Venema, he points out here, okay, well, genetically, the biologists can tell we're further related from orangutans than we are from gorillas, than chimps and humans. Humans and chimps split more recently, 6 or 7 million years ago, I believe. And one of my favorite charts, of which they have several, is like they picked an olfactory gene here. And I think it's easy to explain and easy to basically understand, even if you're not a biologist. You can see there at the top, you have mutations at the top, all of them share. And then you see how the orangutans on the right lack the 212 deletion. And then you see only the chimps, and humans have the 430 deletion. And from there, it's kind of all over the place. So I'm told by biologists that you can go up and down the entire genome and do this. And the only decent explanation is the reason they have different mutations afterward, they don't share them anymore, is because they were split. So it sure looks like we evolved, right? And you see these things like this particular one, American Museum of Natural History. One of the more mind-blowing things that I've seen theologians dialogue with biologists on is actually we have Neanderthal DNA in us. There's a really fun lecture on the Thomistic Institute. Look it up. It's something like, did Christ die to save Neanderthals? I'm going to spoil it for you. The answer is yes, because Christ was part Neanderthal. So there's a lot of Q&A we can do on this sort of stuff, as you could see. So according to the books I've researched, this is what it looks like, more or less. I think the stats, are probably being worked out still. But if you're like me, you probably have 1.5 to 4% Neanderthal DNA. And then the last thing I want to show on this is I have a textbook that is pitting this with Neanderthals. And the reason I just wanted to show that real quick is that it even further complicates our lives as theologians that it looks like Neanderthals were rational. So I have this habit, which I'm sure my students get annoyed at, that I like to complicate their lives. But that's what Socrates did. He's a gadfly. So you want to face reality squarely. You don't want to overly simplify it. And that's what we're doing here tonight. So this raises the real big question of how philosophically and theologically do God and creatures work together? And so as you see that I have up here, a common mistake is to think that an action is either God or a creature. The Catholic view is it's always both and, except a miracle, which we can talk about. But think about conception. In conception, the husband and wife truly give the DNA. They do contribute to the existence of that new baby. But let's face it, we outdo ourselves in it. At least on my part, all I did was give DNA. And kids take months and months, even years, to warm up to their father. But God, we say in theology, what do we say? He infuses the rational, immortal soul, right? But just because Jen and I contributed to the creation of the child does not mean we alone did it. God did it through us. So here's some great quotes. First of all, Aquinas says, it's great to be good in yourself, but it's an even greater perfection to share your goodness so that others have the same traits. I think the proverbial easy example is fishing. Give a man a fish, you feed him for a day, teach him, you feed him for a lifetime. But I'm telling you, my favorite example is fishing. I think I said it last night. It is frustrating to teach children to fish. I like to catch fish. I don't like to unfurl line and cut stuff all night long. But the joy you get from doing it when you see your kids able to fish, let alone a situation where you need the kids to catch them to survive, okay, which is a real thing in history. But the joy of seeing them do that makes the pain worth it. And you know what a good analogy for God always is parents. So he's a good parent. He wants to share these traits with us. And so I think my slide might have advanced on its own. But the second quote there is the Newman one about a greater wisdom. And the third one is from Pope Benedict. He says, the marvel is that God works in evolution, not next to it, like kind of in parallel fashion. He works through it. In fact, there's an image from Aquinas in another context, which is grace. And he says, it's like a saw. And now you can extend the analogy even more that we have power. So I like to cut trees. It's fun to make stuff out of wood and build things. Well, if you cut a decent sized tree with a handsaw, it can be done. And sure, I've cut myself up a few times, but you know what's better is a chainsaw. But when you use a chainsaw, you're really doing it. But let's face it, it was the gasoline or electricity that made it possible. But you really did do it. This is us before God. We make a difference. We truly perform the acts, but God through us. And so I have two analogies. I have to credit my source, which is Jen Ramage, my wife. We love Dante. And at the very end of his Divine Comedy in Paradiso, he speaks of the love which moves the sun and the other stars. Well, I like Neil deGrasse Tyson's stuff, but sometimes he's very philosophically illiterate. He'll say Christian critiques on the internet and not understand what we mean. I could envision him saying, come on, guys, love doesn't move it. Gravity and different forces do. But if you're literate, you realize this is poetry. But God's love that moves the universe is not negated by gravity. And here's Jen's really good analogy. It's from human development. So we say in Psalm 139, a text I was talking about today at lunch with the Bible study group, God knit me together in my mother's womb. Of all people, I got these images from Dawkins. I think it makes a pro-life point, actually. Yes, you begin as an embryo, and Pope Francis talked a lot about embryos. He's been the Pope who spoke the most about the dignity of the human person in embryonic stage. But yeah, you're a zygote, you divide into two, you're a blastocyst, you go through, you look like an alien, all these sorts of stages you go through, all Dawkins, you look like a shrimpy. Okay, then 3D sonograms. Here's a real sonogram. That's one of our kids. And I was really astounded. This is the best sonogram we've ever had, and we've had 8 times 2. That's a 12-week-old baby. But the point would be, we're beginning to understand human development, embryology so much better. And yet, at the end, you come out with a baby, like little James there, and it could appear that we've just contradicted the Bible. Because the Bible says you knit me together. It doesn't say protein unfolding this, an amino acid that. The sacred authors don't know about that. So how do they go together? Well, it's like love moving the universe. God's love moves the universe through fellow creatures. Biology, physics, all the sciences, that's the way God moves the universe. It's our understanding of that. And get this is my first bullet point. We think as Catholics that God's handiwork in creation is all the more marvelous because the creatures do it. Now, I don't like engineering analogies for God because he's not a mechanic, but I think this one works. Who's a better engineer? And this is creepy, but a better engineer, a guy who can make a robot, or a girl who makes a robot that makes robots that become Terminators that kill us all? Well, morally, the second one is not as good. But the second one, that girl is smarter than the first guy. And this is why she killed the universe, basically, killed humans. God has a creative ability to endow us with a capacity. We don't have to do it all ourselves. Second bullet point. We need to recover how to read both of God's books, not only Scripture, but the created world. Because third and finally, if you look at the history of evolution and you look at what we theologians call the history of salvation, it turns out they're both gradual. We say in theology, he began with Abraham basically 3,000 years ago. He could have taught them the Trinity back then, but he didn't because they weren't ready for it. He unfolded it gradually. He could have, according to theologians, created every species instantaneously. Could have, but didn't. Because what God determines absolutely in eternity, Aquinas says, he works out gradually in time. So that's the mystery. Then the question for God, you ask yourself, is why do you do that, God? And then the model is, well, I realize in my life I had to have patience, whether it's vocational discernment or teaching children or learning a subject. You press on always hard, forward, always forward, and yet you realize that God has a gradual plan. So here's my final point then. I wanted to leave you with this slide. This is my encouragement to everybody, especially the science STEM majors, but even people in fields like mine. We have to have the courage to embrace the full breadth of reason. We have to have the courage to stand up and speak Christian truth when that's necessary. We have to have the courage to ask hard questions of our faith, even when it's uncomfortable, because the Catholic belief is that you actually grow deeper in your faith by asking the hard questions. And so last but not least, I said I would return to it. Newman, doctor of the church, within about 13 or so days from now, he says evolution suggests an even greater wisdom of God. And I'll put this little slide with some favorite recommended sources up there, including my book, of course, gotta do the shameless plug. But I wanna call attention, that first one is by Benedict. The second one, Baglow, I took some of my images from. It's actually a high school textbook, but it's really good. He uses it for his freshman at Notre Dame. The third one is very accessible. The fourth one is very deep if you're into Aquinas. Keebler, I'm having him out to speak at my place next year. That's Word on Fire. I was just at their conference the other day. That's very accessible, and that one has a virtue of he is a biologist. So anyway, there's lots of good stuff out there. I thank you for your attention, and I hope we have some time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr.
Yeah.
Image. To get us started with the Q&A, I'm going to have a professor of the natural sciences come up and help us. So for a couple of reasons. One of my goals is that every Catholic student should know that there are tons of Catholic faculty members out there on campus who would love to talk with you. And the second, to kind of model what a conversation can look like between a professional scientist and a theologian. So I'm going to have Dr. Image come back, and I'd like to introduce Professor Jeff Doyle. He's Professor Emeritus in the School of Integrated Plant Science. His research focuses on plant molecular systematics, molecular evolution, and comparative genomics. And he is also a parishioner at St. Catherine of Siena Parish, where he is involved with lots of ministries, but you might recognize him from music ministry, in which he's often involved. So Jeff, thank you so much for being with us today, and I'll hand it over to you to respond to this as a scientist, and then to get us started with some Q&A.
Is that working?
Yes,
Okay.
I think it is.
So first I have to get one thing off my chest. His mother was not a spy. My dad was.
Oh,
Actually worked for the CIA and it was a covert agent for the CIA, actually. So that's another whole story.
yes.
But I will say one thing, and that is that the worst argument I had with my dad, I didn't have many of them, but I did have a couple of doozies. One of them where I hung up the phone on him, and I was in my 50s, I guess, by that time, something like that, was because he took me to task for not fighting as a Catholic evolutionary biologist against Dawkins
Oh.
and company. So he really gave me a hard time and actually wanted to, not sure what he wanted me to do exactly, but I think it was something about like rejecting evolution. I'm not sure what, but I'm a practicing evolutionary biologist. That would have been very difficult for me
Yeah.
to do. And I wish he could have read your book
Yeah.
and listened to this lecture tonight. And I'm going to give a shameless plug for your book as well,
Thank you.
because to prepare for this task that I have here of being a responder, I believe it's called, I actually read most of your book.
Thank you.
And it is a wonderful book. I want to tell you that. A lot of the beginning part of it is much of what you heard here, the same theme, that basically evolution is a theory in that second sense of the word. It's very much proven, and the church has accepted this, as you said, for a long time. That was the part that was very interesting. Well, there's a lot that was interesting to me, but that was one of the things that I thought was fascinating, is I've known that the church has no problem with evolution. I've known that for a long time, and I tried to tell my dad that actually too. But I didn't know just how deep that appreciation for evolution goes and how long it's existed. So Newman and things like that. I did not know about that.
Yeah.
And so the first part of your book talks about much of the evidence for evolution, and much as you did here tonight. The rest of the book explores what it means. And you didn't have time in this short seminar to really tell us a lot of really interesting things that are in there. And Benedict was not my favorite pope, and I won't go into why that's the case, but I came away with a completely different appreciation for him after reading your book. And so much so now that I have in my signature for my emails, I put a little thing at the bottom, a little quote. And I used to have until recently an Aquinas quote, but I've now switched that out for Benedict saying that there's so much evolution, so much evidence for evolution, that it has to be treated as a fact for our benefit, and that it enlightens us and actually, as you said, enlightens us about how great God actually is. And that's what's really fascinating to me, is how that comes across. So one of the questions I have for you, so my job is to get the question and discussion started here. But one of the things is that, so I'm an evolutionary biologist, and I know, because it interests me, that had I ever heard a homily from a priest that talked about the church's position on evolution, and particularly that Pope Benedict, as a scholar, had written and spoken extensively on the subject, I would remember it. So the question is, why has there been, seems to be so little catechesis around this really important issue? I'm really surprised by that.
Yeah.
Because it's, it's the kind of thing we run into.
It is.
Well, a lot of people don't believe, quote unquote, in evolution, and they fall back on religion for that.
Yeah.
And so why is that?
I had a biology student. Can you guys still hear me? I had a biology student at a party the other day asked me, biology, I'm going to say it 5 times. Student asked me if I believed in evolution, and expecting the answer is no. And I said, no, I don't. I said, I don't believe in facts. And that started the conversation going.
Wow.
I wanted to, make this thing happen. So, but the point was, after I was being cheeky, to your question, I think it's an issue of a lot of people just don't know it. I think they're afraid. I think fear is the #1 driving factor. The only homily I can remember hearing about it, besides Pope Benedict's homilies I've read on it, is Monsignor Swetland was a U.S. Naval Academy Rhodes Scholar, and he was our chaplain. I mean, he was a physicist, right? So that's unique. I think it's fear. I think it's just not knowing it. And if I can speak for theologians more than pastors, a lot of them view that as incidental to the faith. It just, it's not very certain. It's not that relevant. So like I have a situation, how do I put this without being too divulged? Let's just say I have a lot of friends who don't want to talk about it. And so people end up thinking more theologians are against evolution than they are. And I don't blame them. I'm the one who gets myself into the fray and gets all the hate mail stuff. But I get a lot of love email too. But I think priests, we'd have to talk to them. But I think a lot of them, there's so many things you have to talk about. How are you supposed to do it all, I think, is seeing it positively. What are you going to talk about in 5 minutes? But I think this is where we lay theologians have a role, is the clergy can't get up and give a homily on everything. But we need, as kind of foot soldiers of Christ, arms and feet of the body, to get out there and share this knowledge. And thankfully, like you see up there, that stuff wasn't there 10 years ago. We're at a blessed time.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting point, but I guess I'm old and I've been going to Mass for a very long time.
Yeah.
And you would think that once in my 40-year career here at Cornell, I might have heard some information about that. I did know, I mean, I knew about that, being an evolutionary biologist and being a Catholic, a practicing Catholic, and treating evolution as I have, as essentially a branch of theology, of faith-seeking understanding, that definition of the term. To me, everything I see, everything I work on has to conform with my faith. I mean, that's where it starts, right? I mean, it's not as though, it's like reading the Bible. When you read the Bible, there's a lot of strange stuff in there, right? But as the church tells us, what is in the Bible is true in the sense that it's what God wants to reveal to us. So it's up to us to figure out what is being revealed. And for me, evolution is the same way.
Yeah.
I see the diversity of life. I work on, and my wife over there, by the way, Jane, ran our lab for 30 years. So she's a practicing molecular evolutionist as well for a very long time. And so we work together as a mom and pop operation, essentially, doing evolutionary biology by looking at phylogenies, by sequencing DNA and looking at how everything fits together, the kind of diagrams that you were showing. And we see in that the unity of life, but it doesn't contradict anything. In fact, it reinforces the fact, as you're saying, that's the hand of God. This is how God creates and continues to create. Now, let me just say, my job was to get the discussion started and not to monopolize. So all of you should be talking, okay?
Yeah.
Why doesn't the
Hold on 1 second, just so the people on Zoom can hear you. And we're going to have questions into the mics. Thank you.
So my question, I'd like to take your question and flip it around, because I've heard more priests talk about evolution, maybe not from the pulpit, but I've heard less biologists speak about God. And even many of the ones I've run into, they're atheists. And if you even mention God, oh, gee, bring God into it, And so what can be done there to open those doors up? And and from your perspective too, and both of your perspectives, it seems like there's more work to be done on that side than necessarily the ecclesiastical side.
Do you want to?
That's more for you.
Well, okay.
That's more for you.
Okay, well,
I'm not going to tell you how to do your discipline.
that's fine. I guess I subscribe largely to St. Francis's view that we should preach always but use words seldom. And so my witness is being a practicing Catholic doing evolutionary biology. That's what I do. And I make it clear that I am a practicing Catholic and that I see no inconsistency with that. And but I don't proselytize in the sense of going out and telling people, hey, evolution is consistent with my theological view. But how could it not be if I'm going to practice my faith and make no bones about it and still be a practicing scientist? I guess that's all I can say. For most, an awful lot of what you were saying is that you can do evolutionary biology without any reference to God at all.
Yeah.
Right?
And I think the one thing I can confidently say on this question is at a Catholic institution, the students expect you to do it, and then you would do it. But at Cornell or somewhere else, you might need to be more implicit, more use the actions, and people can tell the kind of character you are. There is a legitimate diversity of approaches on this. I know, like, my daughter's biology teacher mentions God explicitly, but I know somebody else who you just know through the way they comport themselves that they're a legitimate human being, and that would be sufficient in that person's judgment. Yeah, so I respect all those different approaches, really.
But I think the key is letting people know that your faith is important to you. And I have tried to do that in my life. I don't hesitate to tell my students that I am a Catholic Christian and that that's important to me. And this is the source of my joy in doing the evolutionary biology that I do. This is what infuses everything with joy and spirit for me.
Yeah, that's great.
Hi, how are you?
Hi.
I just wanted to ask about, so it says Eve was made from the rib of Adam.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to see how that fit into like the evolutionary.
Oh, yeah, Eve from Adam's rib is one of my favorites. And I'll use papal language. Pope Benedict speaks of it as the myth of the rib. And by the way the popes like John Paul and Benedict use the word myth, they use it in the way Tolkien, Lewis, and Chesterton do. It's a real but unfocused glimpse of divine truth falling on the human imagination. So myth doesn't equal falsehood. It equals approaching God through the imagination. And so, like, what Pope Benedict will say, and this is building on established biblical scholarship, is that the rib has to have a symbolic significance. So the Catechism says that Genesis describes real events in figurative language. But the theologians get to have the fun debate over how much of the real event is there and what does that actually mean. But the figurative is important. So you always have to ask, what is the symbolic language trying to say? Why the rib? Well, the rib, it's equality. There are religious myths where humans are created out of the foot. Like there's a particular Hindu myth, the Purusha myth, where the lowest class is created out of the divine foot. And that's used to justify class-based discrimination. There are definitely times in our civilization we've had women being considered lower than men. But the actual biblical teaching is she's equal to man. In fact, you could argue she's better. I'm not going to make this argument because I'm a guy. But in the second creation account, which goes in the reverse order of the first one, by the way, Eve comes last. She's the apex of creation. So the rib means equality. There's another layer, a really interesting Jewish scholar I picked this up from, Amy Jo Levine, and I'm just going to say this. Okay, there's an argument from the Hebrew that it wasn't the rib, it was the bone of the male, which every other mammalian, I think, has except human males for mating. How about that for a euphemism? And the Bible does this. It's called etiologies, not in the medical sense, but hatia, it means cause. It's a playful way of describing it. So another example is he's called Adam because he comes from the Adamah, the dry ground. So Adam, you know, it's a Hebrew word, and Hebrew didn't exist for hundreds of thousands of years after the Homo genus existed, or millions of years after. So was his first name Adam? Well, is that the point Genesis is trying to make? Genesis's point is he's a dirtling. He's nothing without God. And then you think about, oh my gosh, the whole Bible has this theme of man is dust of the earth. He's like wind blows you away. And yet, you know, God breathes into him. So if you're an atheist, you'd make fun of that, maybe. But the Jews knew God didn't have a body. God doesn't have a body until he becomes incarnate. So breathing is a metaphor for intimacy. He puts his, what we later call in Latin, the soul, into us, a unique feature that the other creatures don't have. And believe it or not, Pope Benedict, a pope, talked about that sort of stuff repeatedly. So every one of those things that seems contrary to science, you're like, well, that can't be true. It's because it's not true scientifically. It's true on a level, we theologians like to brag, we're the queen of the sciences, you know. But it's true on a level that really is beyond the empirical sciences. We just, as theologians, have to have the humility to realize we have things to learn from the scientists as well. So I hope that helps.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, there we go. So I just wanted to come back to the comment that you made earlier about why don't scientists speak about their faith? So that is a big reason why the Society for Catholic Scientists was formed however long ago, 10 years ago. So it really does provide a forum for practicing Catholics who are scientists to sort of be able to profess their faith. So, and it's good because I'm myself very surprised how many scientists and faculty members that I meet at Cornell actually are Catholics or are Christians or something like that. All right, so I have actually a question. So you mentioned something about this author Kemp or something like that said something about Homo heidelbergensis is Adam.
That's his hypothesis.
Okay,
yeah.
but so I guess sort of connecting that with the previous question, you know, what does that mean?
Yeah.
Like, what does it mean to be the first Adam, and why isn't it to Homo sapiens? And I don't know.
Yeah.
Question in
And I forgot, what's your area again? What's your field?
I'm a biologist, biochemist.
So again, I'm talking to someone who, this is good to know, that's more expert in this area than I am. So I'm not going to be teaching you anything. Theologically, okay, I'm not wedded to that personally. I actually think it's more complicated than that. But the most common, if you're like a lover of Aquinas, you're a traditionally minded Catholic and you're engaging this, that's one of the best hypotheses is there was one moment, there's a biological continuity of body, but they think there's a moment of the infusion of the soul, and then you have a night and day difference in the actions they can perform. I actually strongly suspect, as I suspect most biologists would, that it's a slower thing than that. But it complicates your life as a theologian if it's slower. There's this Mariusz Tabacek is working on that really well. And he has some fascinating things in an article he just put out last month even about original sin and the perfection of the world, how now we know, of course, you scientists all know, things were dying billions of years before man. So there's complicated things you could ask me about that on that too. But the theologian stands to gain, we can guarantee something that Catholic theology requires, which is God gave us original sanctifying grace. He didn't create us sinful. And yet, he created us in the line of evolution with all these adapted instincts, which, you know, you don't blame an animal for it, like I was saying last night, but you would blame a human for it. So theology is trying to capture, we have an immortal soul, we had original justice, sanctifying grace, and it does tidy it up if that was a one-time thing.
I'd like to make a comment about that, and that is that one has to make a distinction between a species and an individual, right? And a species is composed of many populations and individuals. And when we talk about evolution, we're talking about populations and species, not so much individuals that comprise those. But any trait, any individual trait like blue eyes or curly hair or something like that, originally arose in one individual somewhere. So I don't have a problem as an evolutionary biologist thinking that there was the origin of any particular characteristic of humanity in one individual somewhere along the way. Now, it may have arisen in multiple individuals in parallel through mutations or whatever. But when you're talking about, I think, when you're talking about the soul and you're talking about morality and those sorts of things, you're not talking about biology per se. You're talking now about something much more like cultural events, ideas, potentially. And I'll just say potentially. That's outside my area. That's now anthropology and things like that. I don't have answers for those things, but if you think about something originating somewhere, it has to originate in one individual. I mean, mutations originate in one particular place in one particular time, right? So, and then they increase in frequency, and then they become fixed in populations, and in a species, they become characteristics of species, those traits that you had mapped on the phylogeny. That's how that happens. There's a process involved, but it originates with individuals. So I'm not going to go out on a limb and say that there was a particular Adam and an Eve and it all fits the biblical narrative, but I have no trouble with the notion that something like an appreciation for God, as you say in your book, the ability to say you to God, right? You make that point beautifully in the book. And that would have arisen potentially in one individual, staring up at the stars and seeing the beauty of creation and appreciating something that none others in its species, whatever that species was, recognized. Whatever we call that species, and that's another thing. We can go there with taxonomy and the uncertainties about what a species is even. So that's another whole story.
I think that's a great response. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I had a follow-up question regarding the moment that sin entered the world. So we know that we take the rib concept as an extended metaphor, but when we talk about Adam and Eve gaining this knowledge, this consciousness, from a neuroscience perspective, how would we explain that, like the gaining of consciousness? Would that be
I love that one.
exact moment, or would it be the active choice to do something morally wrong that was the entering of sin? So how would neuroscientists explain that moment?
Well, I'm not one, so I'm limited on that front. But I would say this, speaking from the theology who's dabbled a little bit, I think I can confidently say a couple of things. One is about the biblical view. There's different ways of reading it, obviously, but it makes it look like they didn't know what good and evil even were, like they didn't have moral consciousness. And one view, which is not I don't think it's the Orthodox Catholic view, is their fall was simultaneous with their gaining of knowledge. The actual Catholic view is they had to have full knowledge to commit a mortal sin, right? And so how does that work? Well, it's actually nice to know Hebrew sometimes. So to know in Hebrew, yada, it means to know facts. And if you know a Romance language, it can be both the know familiar and the know fact version. But it's also covenantal intimacy. A new Pharaoh arose at the opening of Exodus who did not know Joseph. There's no way he didn't know him. He didn't have a covenant with him. Adam knew Eve, his wife, and a new person came into being. He knew her biblically, you know? So they didn't have the experience of good and evil yet. So the way the popes interpret the narrative of Genesis tends to be, they knew what it was. They had the consciousness, but they couldn't help themselves. I have got to, sex is a good example. You just gotta do it, even though it's wrong, people sometimes fall into, or for me, it's cookies during Lent. I know I gave up that cookie, but I gotta have it. And I don't, does that help anything with, they already had the knowledge? Then the question of how gradually they gain the knowledge, if there was one first person to look up at the stars, is a fascinating meditation, but they definitely had to have it already.
If I can just add, consciousness is something that's debated about what it is. Even if you're a neurobiologist, you know that there's a debate between philosophers and neurobiologists about what actually constitutes consciousness. We don't understand that at all.
Do you want to close this out? Yeah, I was going to ask, so
you had said that, well, the soul didn't evolve, but it was the body that evolved. But if you're a hylomorph, if you subscribe to hylomorphism,
Yeah.
I would say, why doesn't the soul also evolve as well?
Thank you for that question. You'll remember this probably. Okay, this is another reason to make Pope Benedict a tagline for someone. So hylomorphism, for those who aren't familiar, but you are, it's the unity of form, morphe in Greek, and hyle, matter, and the human, the body, soul. And so, yeah, if you're truly a hylomorphist, there's a way of being more Thomistic than Thomas was, I think. And that is, I mean, there's a couple daring things that Pope Benedict writes during the time of a professor. But as Pope, he was, well, can't be speculating on this stuff as Pope. But he says, the soul is the form of the body. That's a traditional saying. But he says the body also forms the soul. Very evocative, very daring. And what he's trying to get at, I think, is something that you're gesturing towards, which is he implicitly critiques Pius XII on this very statement about the soul not evolving. And on the one hand, it can't evolve because it doesn't have matter. But if you're going to be truly hylomorphic and truly take body-soul unity seriously, one of the things that Father Tabachek up there is working on, that I do a little bit of work on, is, okay, what we say as really strong Thomistically trained people is, if there's a change in the body, there's a change in the soul. So it's not that God plops a soul in, right? The wonder, Benedict said, is that it happens through. So the action is how you know the type of soul. Plants do plant soul things, and cheetahs do cheetah soul things, right? And so yeah, it really is a unity. But the way Pope Pius XII in 1950, mind you, he's talking about this is, we need to guarantee there's something that isn't merely material. And that's what Pope Benedict is trying to say, the guy who's actually talked about this the most. So we still continue to speak that way, and I still say it myself, the soul can't have evolved. But what we mean by that is it's not a thingy. And I love this analogy for the soul, by the way, guys. In my intro to theology class, I use this example. I stole from a 1950s Catholic, and it is, okay, if you're looking at a pot of tea boiling, you look at the tea, and then especially in the age of electricity, not just fire, you go, well, how's that boiling? You can't see it, but you can deduce it must have a cause. And I've been in the presence of a dead body before, not just animal bodies, but the human animal body. And that person I loved is dead. We say the difference is the soul, what do we say, guys? The soul left the body, but the soul doesn't have matter. It can't leave physically. So get this, we have to use metaphorical language. Even the word soul being infused, that's what Aquinas says. Infused means to pour or soak. So you necessarily have to use metaphorical language to talk about the soul. And then the key, and what makes theology considered such a hard, quote, science, is that you have to use the metaphor while simultaneously holding in mind that the difference between the reality is even greater than the similarity. That's actually the Fourth Ecumenical Council, the Fourth Lateran Council that said that. So I hope that gestures in the right direction. We could talk more about it after if you want.
Thank you. I think on that note, I'm going to close things formally for the evening, although please feel free to linger and to approach both Professor Doyle and Professor Ramage with further questions. Before we all leave tonight, I want to give a big shout out to Kelly Soprano back there for a wonderful feast, to the student service team, to the Catholic Studies Fellows for setting it all up, to Giovanni, my main man over here, and to my parents for watching our kids tonight. Couple of announcements. Coming up this Friday is a Thomistic Institute lecture at 5 p.m. in Rockefeller Hall. The title of this lecture is Eating and Drinking to the Glory of God with Professor Michael Foley of Baylor University. I also want to make a plug for a Ignatius Press Children's Book Fair at Immaculate Conception Church, organized by Colas on December 6th. Would love your help with that. And if you have any nieces, nephews, little brothers and sisters, please make your Christmas purchases there. And then finally, a couple of closing things. Giovanni and some other students will be coming around with surveys about this event. We really do need your help and your feedback for knowing what you want to talk about next. So once you've completed the form, you can return it to, there will be a basket on that table back there where Victoria is gesturing. Thank you very much. Before you leave. And then some housekeeping. When you leave, if you are able-bodied, if you could please help make the packing away the room easy by stacking a chair, folding tablecloths. If Kelly could get at least 4 people to help out with moving tables. And then finally, please feel free to take the cookies home.
And saving a cookie for the Professor Ramage would be a very necessary moment too.
Okay, yeah, someone get on that, saving a cookie. And then finally, before I forget, I believe today is the last day to register for SEEK, the conference in January. Excellent. Thank you so much, Kelly. Okay, well, before we all leave, thank you again, Professor Ramage, for making the trip out here for these wonderful events, Professor Doyle for this wonderful conversation, which I think has showed how important it is for all of our disciplines to be conversing with one another.
May I say one more thing?
Please.
Read his book. I'm absolutely serious about this. I mean, it is, don't blush, please, but it is really one of the best things that I have done for my faith in recent memory, is reading this book. It is that good. It really covers so many things that are these topics people are asking about, the soul and all of those kinds of things. It's all covered in there because theologians have thought about this. Our Pope has thought about this. Our popes have thought about it. Read it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, please join me in a round of applause
Thank you,
and
guys.
good night, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks. Appreciate that.